Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new quilting basics video. In our last video we learned a lot about quilt basting, and now it's time for some machine quilting. And the very first step that a lot of people take for their quilts is stitching in the ditch. So let's learn more about this stitching in the ditch with our walking foot. The first step to stitching in the ditch is to plan your path, how you're going to move around the block with the least amount of thread breaks. Because every time we break thread, we have to tie off and bury or secure our thread tails in some way. And I'll teach you how to do that in another video. So just looking around at this block, I've decided to pull up thread here between the flower and the stem and to stitch in the ditch around the flower and then around one side of the stem, and then work around the vase. And that way I reduce a thread break, and then I'll work back up around the stem and I'll tie off only one time right there. So that's really easy. And then I'll pull up thread over here in the space between the block itself and the border, and I'll stitch in the ditch in those seam lines as well. So you can see that how I use ditching is as an outline. I like it to separate the design I have in one space from the design in another space. So by having that ditching in this area around the flower, it'll kind of separate out that space from the background. So they won't seem like they're meshing into one another. This is mostly how I make the backs of my quilts very visually appealing. Because with that outline stitching, it looks very neat and clean on both the front and the back of the block. So now that we have our path planned, I'm going to pull up thread right here between the flower and the stem. So to pull up thread, I'm going to drop my needle down and bring it all the way up to the point where that needle is starting to drop back down into the machine. And that means that the top thread has made a full pass through the bobbin area, and I can just give that top thread a tug, and that will bring up a loop, and that is your bobbin thread. You want to do that every time you start quilting. And the reason you want to do that is so your bobbin thread is up on the top, it's nice and secure, and it's not going to make a mess on the back of your block. So now that we're set up, we've got both of our bobbin threads tucked behind the foot, I'm going to drop my needle back down right into that seam allowance, and then I'll start stitching. Now I've set my machine up to stitch at 1.6 millimeters. That's producing a nice tight stitch. It's very secure. And with my walking foot, I want to also make sure that I'm ending with my needle in the down position. If you don't have that set as an automatic feature, if you don't have that capability, then you can always rotate your hand wheel every time you stop too. That's fine. That's just fine as well. So when it comes to stitching in the ditch, your aim is just to stay right in the ditch, to stitch right in that seam line where those pieces came together. And I am using white thread for this. This is white isocord thread, and I know that definitely shows up on the quilt, so I'm trying hard not to hop out of the ditches, or if I do hop out of the ditch, I'm going to hop out on the side of the beige fabric so it won't be as visible. The reason that I'm using white thread is because that's the color I've decided to use as the quilting for all of my different designs. And I also like the contrast. It's just something that appeals to me. And we're going to have another video on picking thread colors. So if you're feeling a little confused, or you just feel like you really want to see the different effects that you can get with thread color, then definitely check out that video. So you can see all I do is stitch right along that ditch, and then I stop with my needle in the down position and I pivot, and that turns the block, and then I just keep on stitching. And you can speed up with this as you gain confidence, and if you're sure that you're not going to hop out or veer out of the ditch. It is very easy to stitch in the ditch with a walking foot, and that's the reason why I started doing this, is it really is easier and faster to do it with this foot rather than in free motion. Although I should add, you can do this both in free motion and with your walking foot. A lot of times what I have done in the past is something called ditching and filling, where I would have maybe filled in the background with stippling and then gone straight into ditching. And that's a-okay too. It's something that I think is really worth playing with. If you're feeling like you want a challenge this year, then try doing this in free motion instead. The walking foot is unique in that it is feeding the fabric forward, and that means that we're using the machine in the way the machine is kind of intended to be used. And so we always have to have the quilt facing forward. We always have to be able to see, you know, basically feeding straight in underneath the foot. And that means we're going to have to rotate a lot, especially as we come around the flower and start working into the stem. You'll see just how many times I'm going to rotate and shift the block around so that way it's always facing forward. Now with walking foot quilting, we have a lot of options when it comes to stitch length, because in this case the machine is controlling our stitch length. So I told you I set mine to 1.6 millimeters for this. It's just a nice small stitch and I like the look of it. But you can really set it to anything that you like. If you wanted a 2 millimeter stitch, that's fine too. It's worth taking a little time in a practice sandwich to play with different settings on your machine and see what you like best. If you like a slightly longer stitch, that's a-okay. Go with that. So you can see I'm just rotating around here, carefully staying in the ditch. And the rotations are really no worry. You know, our block is nice and small and definitely easy to use because of the small size. It's easy to manipulate and rotate around on a small machine. So it's not going to be a big, you know, hassle to rotate it as you stitch each line. As I gain more confidence, I put my foot down a little bit, but I always have to remind myself, if I start, you know, getting sloppy, I need to slow down and be more careful. Watch out for areas such as points and corners. Those can be areas where you have lots and lots of seam allowances all built up in one place, and if you hit it, you know, just exactly wrong, sometimes it can cause your needle to gag up a little bit, and you know, sometimes even to break a needle. So anytime that I'm coming into an area where I know there is going to be a lot of seam allowance, I slow down and I just take one stitch at a time through that area. Of course, this is greatly reduced by the fact that we press our seam allowances open, and that's going to definitely help. But it's always good to just kind of keep your machine in mind as far as, you know, what it's going through. And anytime you're coming up onto an area of lots of seam allowances, just slow down a little bit and get to know your machine. You know, how hard do you have to press the foot pedal in order to take just one single stitch? That's kind of good to know. So I'm coming back around this opposite side of the vase, and you can see it really doesn't take very much time to stitch in the ditch. And it's a very popular method for securing blocks. Just depending on how much, you know, what your batting that you chose for your block, you could probably stitch this in the ditch and that would be all the quilting that you need. The reason that we're adding more quilting is simply because we want it to look pretty, and we're adding extra decorative texture with all of these different quilting designs. Now another thing you're probably wondering about is needles. What needle am I using as I stitch in the ditch? Well, I use the same needle for piecing and for quilting, whether it's walking foot quilting or free motion quilting. I use the same exact needle, and that's a Schmetz Universal 8012, and it's just the needle that I found does almost everything well for me and my machines. It's worth trying lots of different sizes and types. If you find a particular needle that causes your thread to skip or causes your thread to break, watch out for that, you know, and maybe pick something different. You want to have the least amount of thread breaks, the least amount of skip stitches. And anytime that you see something like that, where like the thread's not connecting, that's a sign that maybe a different needle would be a good idea to try, either a different size or a different type. Okay, so I've reached back to my flower and now I'm going to break thread, and I do that by raising my needle to the highest position, lift the foot to take the tension off of it, and then I slide it a distance away, and usually it's about 4 to 5 inches. And then I cut the thread tails, leaving them nice and long. So right here I have my top thread and the bobbin thread still in the back, and I want to bring that to the surface. So I'm just going to give it a little tug, and that pulls up a little loop. And I just inserted a little needle in that loop and it'll come right up to the surface. I'm going to tie these off and bury them in another video so you can see how to do that. With the center of the block stitched in the ditch, I pulled up thread here right on the border, right in the seam line between the center block and the border fabric, and I'm just going to stitch in the ditch in this area as well. Now, a common question that I'm always asked is it safe to stitch right in the ditch, especially if you have pressed your seam allowances open? And yes, I think this is perfectly fine. I wouldn't be doing it if I thought it was a problem. And the reason why I think it's okay is because we pieced our fabrics together with very secure thread. I used Arfil 50 weight Mako cotton thread, and I also used a very short stitch length when I was piecing the blocks together. So I lowered my stitch length to 1.5 millimeters, and that locks the fabrics together really securely. That allows me to press those seam allowances open, and then whenever I go to quilt, I can stitch right in the ditch. And basically this is just adding more thread. It's adding another layer of thread and security to the quilt. I do not think that it's in any way a risk or a problem for the quilt. I've never once seen, like I've had this question asked many times that maybe my needle would pierce the threads holding the fabrics together, and that would cause the fabrics to come undone or to come unraveled. And I have never seen that happen. I've been stitching in the ditch like this and piecing like this for years, so I think it's perfectly fine. And it's worth trying if you have blocks that you have pieced and pressed the seam allowances to one side. Play with those a little bit and just see how hard it is when you have ditches that are really raised on one side and really low on the other. It's really challenging to stay right in the ditch. And I love having it like this because it's so flat and so easy to stitch over. So that is how I stitch my blocks in the ditch and how I use ditching to outline my different quilting designs. So now that you know how to do this step by step, get your block ditched and meet me back here as we learn how to free motion quilt these beautiful designs in the next video. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning more about stitching in the ditch and that you've gotten your block ready to go and it's ready for free motion quilting next. If you have any questions about this process, definitely ask in the comments below. I'm here to help you learn how to quilt. And of course, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new quilting videos coming out every week. Until next time, let's go quilt.